Hey everyone, it's Jamison Cable of the Land Between the Meadows, Kentucky History Podcast. I just want to say thank you for your support and listening to this episode. For all the updates on our podcast and YouTube channel, youtube.com/Kentucky History Channel, like and follow us on Twitter and Facebook at KY History Pod. If you're enjoying the podcast, give us a good rating and review on Apple Podcasts or the podcast platform that you're listening to. If you're looking for ways to support the podcast, an easy and simple way is to share it on Facebook or any other social media and tell your friends. You can also go to audibletrial.com/KYHistoryPod and get a free book of your choice. And finally, you can visit patreon.com/KYHistoryPod if you want extra content from us. If you're already a patron, thank you for your support. It means so much to us. All the links I've mentioned are in the description of the podcast, so go check them out. Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoy this episode. And remember, if it's not about Kentucky, it ain't worth a hill of beans. Welcome back, everybody, to the Land Between the Meadows, a Kentucky History Podcast. We're here again looking at the Civil War a little bit. We're going to talk about Braxton Bragg.
Woohoo!
Woo! You know, nothing like the country divided, fighting against each other.
I'm into it, man. We're here now.
So
We got a Civil War going on right now.
I know.
It's cooking on the front burner.
Braxton Bragg, interesting fella. We talked about him a little bit, how big of a jerk he was.
He's ignorant.
But more importantly, we're focused on the Battle of Perryville, which, what happened in Kentucky and Boyle County. So how are we starting this one?
Well, we've already said Braxton Bragg's a jerk, and I want to start with that. Braxton Bragg was probably hands down, of all the generals on both sides in the Civil War, was the poorest general ever. He was really dumb. He was ignorant. And not only was he stupid and ignorant as a commander, but as a person, he was a lowlife. Mm-hmm. He really was. So, instead of always talking about good things about people, Bragg was a freaking idiot. And he couldn't get along with anyone. Yeah, all the people that served around him hated him. Mm-hmm. Here's some of his personal things. He never took blame for anything. Yeah. He blamed everything. Does it sound familiar? He blamed everything on somebody else. Constantly. Yes. And he berated people. He called them names. I mean, here we go. Yeah. I mean, he just belittled people. He hurt their feelings. He said harsh things to them. Just things that were just so unnecessary. Mm-hmm. And he was just a total jerk. He had no tactics. Well, I hate to say no tactics. Really, he had no tactics at all as a general. He believed in just frontal assaults. Just constantly. Oh, they're set up on the hill and they got artillery. Let's go get them, boys. And
fire the cannon.
Yeah, just fire the cannon fire. He did that. We talked about Breckinridge, John C. Breckinridge, and Breckinridge just... at Stones River, for instance, Breckinridge, Bragg ordered him, and Breckinridge complained. He said, "Man, they're going to just cut us up and going to kill us all." And
what are you thinking?
What are you thinking? And you want me to get out in front of them, which he did, and lead them, in direct assault into people behind fortifications with heavy artillery, and you're wide open in a field, just like Gettysburg, and Pickett's charge, all over again. Well, that was Bragg, and I think it was the Battle of Chickamauga that he did well in. Somehow it was just a freak accident. He got the Union on the run, and then he just stopped. Yeah, he just stopped. He wouldn't follow up, and all of his officers were just like, "Man, this is what I've been waiting for the whole war, is to get them on the run, and then go after them, and punish them." And the same thing, when Johnson was killed at Shiloh, and Breckinridge. Had them on the run, was pushing them into the river. It was their whole design was to force the Union back into Pittsburgh Landing before they could get reinforcements, drive them right into this river, make them swim the river, And they pushed them and got right up to the brink, and it was 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and Bragg said, ordered halt. It's the end of the day. Let's stop. And Breckinridge
dinner
was
time,
like,
boys.
Dinner time, boys. And that was like, Breckinridge was like, oh my God, I can't believe he's ordering us to stop.
Yeah.
And this is what we've dreamed of. This is what all of our plans and everything were for. We finally got him on a run. And then you talk about Shiloh, and you talk about the Hornet's Nest and the Peach Orchard. The Hornet's Nest is this place out in the middle of the field that's just heavy artillery, just, wide open field across. And Bragg, sends probably Breckinridge, I'm not sure, out there to attack it. And they just annihilate the Confederates, and they retreat. And Bragg says, go get them again, boys. And so, they've been doing well up until this time. So they just take them wide open field again. They charge right across, and they just annihilate the Confederates, just kill them. Come back. They do it again. They get annihilated again. Just hundreds, thousands of them dying, screaming, and everything. Bragg comes up, and Breckinridge says, it looks like things are a little tough out there. Like we've lost half our army.
Yeah.
This is not good. Can we go around to the side and bypass them or something? Bragg says, no, charge ahead, and he just totally annihilated the Confederates.
Yeah.
And of course, it wasn't Bragg charging; he's just ordering it.
Yeah.
So it's.
I don't know about the entire Civil War, but would it be safe to say that Bragg was part of the undoing?
Totally. And he was, and here's no better stance when you talk about Jefferson Davis. He, unlike Lincoln, Jefferson Davis was very political, just like a lot of Southerners, and he wanted the old boys club, and Bragg had served with him in the Mexican War. And they were buddies. I think they roommated maybe at West Point. Maybe not roommates, but they were the same class. And they were buddies there. Jefferson Davis never really did like Bragg, but Bragg had a real high social standing. Yeah. And Davis evidently was envious of that. And so he kept Bragg on as a failing general, where Lincoln would replace people. They'd get the job done. Yeah. And so Bragg just, he was in charge of the Western Theater. Bragg was in charge of the Army of Mississippi and then the Army of Tennessee and, the Western Theater. And really, Shiloh and Perryville were the two big highlights of the Western Theater, and Bragg lost them both. Yeah. He was just a real idiot in the way that he thought and so forth. When you get to Perryville is really the high water mark of the Western Theater. The loss of Perryville and the retreat back into Tennessee by the Confederacy. That was, a bad thing for the South. And, of course, Bragg was responsible for all of it, as usual. He's just a real jerk. Everything you talk about, Bragg. The only thing he did was, the Army, he had like one division, I think, Bragg did, and Buell, who was the Northern commander, had 4, I believe. And even though Buell had 4, he really screwed up in the Battle of Perryville, and that's kind of what let Bragg do so well there, if you want to say he did well. But Bragg got to Perryville first, and there's a horrible drought on, and there's no water, and there's a big spring near what today is Bragg's headquarters there on the Chaplin River, Chaplin River, just outside of Perryville, about a quarter of a mile. And there's a house there, an old brick house, still there today, and that was where Bragg had his headquarters. And right down the hill from that house is a huge cave with fresh running water out of it, and there was a pool of cool, clean water, which was incredible. And Bragg made his headquarters there, right there on the spot. Here's 2 armies that are just dehydrated because there's no water. The heat's incredible. The whole Midwest has just been dry for a long, long time. The Chaplin River is dried up except for just a few spots of mossy, algae-infested water. And actually, the battle started when a Union outpost there at Bottom's house came down. There was a pool of water there, and the Confederates, a group of them, met the Union cavalry, and they started skirmishing right there over the water hole. They started fighting over water. And... that was pretty incredible. I'm not going to give let you want to. I'm not going to give all the details of the Battle of Perryville.
Well, there's a whole lot of. There's a
whole lot, and there's so many experts on it. And if I start talking about it, I'm sure everybody's. He's like Bragg. He didn't know beans from apple butter. Even though I lived over there for 15 years and studied the Civil War every day and walked every piece of the ground of the Battle of Perryville. Hunted for relics and found Confederate belt buckles in my front yard and casket markers from Bottom, who was a casket maker. It was a famous battle there, and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, there's loads of books written about it.
Loads of books on it. The Battle of Chaplain Hills, But and also, we know about war a lot as a first source through diaries.
Yeah.
And one diary that was uncovered a few years ago by a Confederate soldier who was marching, a Union soldier marching from Louisville. And he said, that talked about how thirsty and how dry and how hot everything was. And said there was a farm pond that was about empty. It was just full of scum and mud, but there was a little bit of muddy water in it. And he went and filled his canteen, and he was filling his canteen. He looked in the pond, and there was a bloated, dead mule in the pond. And that's what they were drinking. They all rushed down, and that was in his diary.
Yeah.
And they all filled their canteens with this bloated, dead mule laying there in the water. I mean, that's how desperate they were.
Yeah, desperate times. Whew.
And there was another time that, in the Battle of Perryville, one of the Union regiments, they were right in front of the Bottoms house. I go down there quite a bit. You can go into the park that way. There's kind of some trails. It's now a wildlife refuge. A lot of it is. I'm going to have a picnic out there next week, as a matter of fact. My family's coming up from North Carolina.
Awesome. Yeah.
So they were filling their canteens, and they stacked their rifles about 50 yards from where they went down a small bank.
Yeah.
And, of course, the Confederates came up on them and just shot the holy fire out of them. They caught them down there with their pants down.
Yeah. Literally.
Literally. Standing in the creek. So that was one thing. And just, several personal stories that I can tell is my first house that I lived in was an old log house over in Troy, Kentucky, Woodford County. Probably about, I'm going to guess about 18 miles, maybe 20 miles from Perryville. And it was an old 2-story log house, and the family lived there was called the Black family. That was their last name. And they had a son who had joined, I believe it was the Confederate Army, like 3 days before. And the mother, they could hear rumbling from the Battle of Perryville. They knew there was a contest going on because even 15, 18 miles away, they could hear it somewhere.
Yeah.
And that night, she woke her husband up and told him that she had had a dream and said that their son had been shot and he was on a hill leaning up against a cedar tree.
Yeah.
And was wounded seriously. And they got in their carriage, their buggy, and they drove the 20 miles over through Mercer County. And as the sun came up, of course, it was just devastation everywhere and people dying. And they drove through the countryside, and sure enough, on a hill, they saw a cedar tree, and they drove up to it, and there was their son, and he had been shot through his body.
Whoa.
And they put him in the carriage, bound him up, and took him back to Troy and nursed him back to health, and he lived.
Wow.
And that was the story with the house that I lived in and restored there in Troy. So, strange things happen.
That is quite.
They were clairvoyant. Yeah. There's a lot of stories like that about Perryville. There's some interesting facts too, just in general about Perryville, and as a 4th and 5th grade public school teacher that taught social studies, and in 4th grade Kentucky history, one of the questions that's always brought out is that Perryville was the largest battle fought in the state of Kentucky, the largest Civil War battle, largest battle of any kind, but of Civil War. There were actually 72,000 combatants, and there were over 55,000 Union soldiers, and almost 17,000 Confederate soldiers in the area.
Okay.
But the Union Army, and this is really interesting. The Union Army didn't employ. There were only 20,000 Union troops, even though he had almost 60,000, 72,000, or almost 60,000, I guess. Union troops, only 20,000 of them were used against the 16,000 Confederates were engaged. And that was because Buell, who was, if you know the geography, if you come from Springfield towards Perryville, you go to Bardstown, then Springfield, then Perryville.
Yeah.
About, 5 or 6 miles outside of Perryville, Don Carlos Buell, who was the Union commander, had made his headquarters, but the day before he'd fallen off his horse.
Oh.
And he injured himself.
Yeah.
And he was laying around in bed moaning that, he hurt his leg or his back or something. And his generals kept coming in and saying, looks like there's going to be a major confrontation. It's underway.
Yeah.
We've hit the main division of Confederate soldiers. And he goes, you're crazier than hell. He goes, I can hear and I haven't heard a sound or a word. So he denied it. He was in total denial.
Yeah.
Practically the first, stages of the battle. And it was called acoustic shadow. And it's because there's rolling hills that the hills going in that direction block the sound waves. So just on the other side of the hill, practically, you can have a major battle raging, the cannon, and on the other side of the hill, where they blocked it, you couldn't hear it.
Wow.
And he couldn't hear it, and he was in total denial. And his officers would come in and say, "Sir,
we
emergency. We gotta go, man. We got this, that, and the other." And he goes, there's nothing going on. There's just some people, scraping. Calm down.
And, we outnumber them 3-1. We're okay.
That's right. And he only used a third of his army. So,
wow.
And that was the reason that Bragg, even though he pretty much won the field somehow and did well, retreated during the night, left the campfires burning, and all of his soldiers retreated on through Bryantsville and down through Cumberland Gap into Tennessee to get out of there because Bragg realized that he was up against nearly 60,000, the next day, even though he had pushed him back.
How long did it last?
There was skirmishing, I think, one day, around the water hole, and then the next day, it was pretty much one day.
Yeah.
And people that, from diaries and things, said both Union and Confederate, and some were in the Battle of Shiloh, which was a terrible battle, and all these Civil War battles said that Perryville, that one day of fighting, was the most fierce fighting, and actually equal fighting that they had ever experienced in all their years of the Civil War. And there's one place, I think it's called Peter's Hill, that these Union cannons were there, and the Confederates were just like charging them blankly with bayonets and fighting them off. And the Confederates took this hill 3 different times and were pushed off of it.
Yeah.
But they were fighting with knives and bayonets. They're shooting and they just engage each other. And they said, the Confederates said, one of them in the diary, there was so much blood spilled at the top of the hill and on the side of the hill that they couldn't get their footing, that they were slipping and falling down. There was so much blood infused on the side of the hill. That just gives you a picture. I talked to a lawyer over in Lancaster who had done some studying of the Perryville and used to go over there battle. And he said that he read some documents that said that in different areas of the Perryville that they were so close to each other, shooting to each other, that people would become nervous. Remember, these are muzzle loaders, and they would shove the ramrod down, and they would forget to pull the ramrod out, and they would fire it. And there were people laying around that looked like Indians with arrows sticking out of their stomach where they'd fired the ramrod by mistake. And they were just like porcupine.
Yeah, wow.
Laying all over the place. And they said that was a real clue that things were fairly intense. Like you're just, frantic to get your gun loaded and shoot, or you're going to be killed yourself. So those were, just some different stories. There were 21 different states within the forces of the Battle of Perryville. There were soldiers from Alabama and Arkansas, even from Florida, of course, Georgia, and then from the north, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas Regiment, from the south, Louisiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, from the south, Mississippi, North Carolina, New York, soldiers from New York.
Everybody.
Ohio had tons, Pennsylvania had tons, Wisconsin had tons. Of course, Tennessee was a major player, Texas, and even Virginia. And Perryville, is considered the high water mark of the Confederacy West, much as Gettysburg would be the high water mark of the East.
Yeah.
So it was a really important battle. Historians say that, and it was only after dark that Bragg realized that, he was totally outnumbered at Perryville, and it was Joe Wheeler, who was out on the Lebanon Road, that came in and told him, said, "Hey, I'm holding off, 2, regiments of federal troops, and they're going to come busting through in the morning. You better be ready for them. You're going to be outnumbered 3-1."
Yeah.
But they said that Bragg was in a mood that Bragg thought that when he came into Kentucky, came up from Tennessee, he came into Kentucky, that he said that he thought he was like, God's gift to the earth, that Kentuckians would like run out, all the farm boys would run out and join forces, and his army would swell. He came into Kentucky in a way to recruit.
Yeah.
And it didn't happen.
Oh.
And so he was in a mood, everyone said, when the Battle of Perryville started. He couldn't believe it. And Kirby Smith, who was in Frankfort, who was a Confederate cavalry officer, he's the one that told Bragg that he was going to just ride through, and he was a real gallant cavalry officer, that people would just come out from everywhere and join the Confederate cause because the Confederates were so wonderful, and Kentucky didn't do it.
Yeah, yeah.
But Kirby Smith had promised Bragg that it would just be all the way. So the combination of factors with him being outnumbered 3-1 and, Bragg always in retreat, even if he was winning, he wanted to go back, even though he had won a tactical victory that day. October the 8th, we need to say the date, I guess, 1862.
Pivotal point in the war.
Pivotal point in the war. He cut out. But it may have been best that he did. But he was winning the battle, and he was in position, and he had things going for him. Other generals wouldn't have probably done that, maybe. I don't know. But as we said, Perryville was the second bloodiest battle of the Western theater in the whole war. It produced 7,621 total casualties.
Wow.
4,220 for the Union, 3,401 for the Confederate. And last week, I was at a yard sale in Mercer County, just on the backside of the Battle of Perryville, and a guy had a Confederate Tennessee rifle he brought out of his house. He was selling all these knickknacks.
Yeah.
And he said, I asked him if he had any guns. He goes, yeah, and he told me the story. He had a Tennessee rifle, and it was documented. He knew the man's name that had it, and he died. The man had been wounded and had been cared for down there.
Yeah.
Knew it was like the 17th Tennessee Regiment, and it was a really very original, beautiful gun. I bought it from him, and took it up to Lawrenceburg, Indiana, and sold it to a lawyer. But it was really nice when you get the ambiance of something, tells you all the history of it. So I was real pleased to have that, real proud of it. I wish I could find more. But they told me, and I had the only original wooden casket made in Perryville in my antique store that I had down there for a long time, and I left it with the antique store. As far as I know, it's still down there. People can see it. There was a lumber yard down on the corner of Perryville, and that's where we're making caskets. And they said, local people said that up to a year after the Battle of Perryville, people were still dying from the wounds.
Wow.
And many people that were wounded that recovered stayed there and married. These young soldiers married.
Yeah.
And I had a friend that was at his great-grandfather was in the Battle of Perryville, and he was from Tennessee, and it was a Cummins. A lot of people know the Cummins family. And there was a hospital there, a Confederate hospital. It was a house. They turned a house, the McKnight's house, into a hospital. And his kin were in the hospital, and he was telling a family story that after the Battle of Perryville, the next day after, there was a Union sniper who'd climbed up in a tree and was actually shooting. The wounded were laying out in the yard and stuff. Yeah. And he was shooting some of the wounded and doctors, everything else, from the tree. And he said, give me a damn gun. He gave a gun, and he said it was way off up in the tree. And he leaned out the window of the house and shot him out of the tree. And that was a family story. So that ended the Union sniping. Yeah, but I mean, stories like that are kind of interesting, I think. But he told that of his family story. He laid back down in bed and nearly died, but he married the woman that was taking care of him.
Wow. That's interesting to see how those people ended up staying. Yeah. Which I would assume to travel would be kind of hindrance if you were recovering from a wound and
The 16th Tennessee had 219 casualties out of 370 engaged, which was they lost over 59% of their regiment they suffered the highest percentage of casualties.
Mm-hmm.
They were the ones charging those cannons, I think, and going hand to hand, the blood slipping up and down the hill, slip and slide. And a lot of people say, well, the battle started over water. It wasn't over water. Buell was trying to find Bragg and cut him off, as he was going towards central Kentucky and Harrodsburg and so forth.
Yeah.
But they were fighting over water. They said that it was so dry, the Ohio River at Louisville, that some of Buell's people that came from Indiana, some of them wanted to desert, I guess.
Yeah.
And they got to Louisville, and it was so hot and dry, and there wasn't enough water that a whole bunch of them just walked across the Ohio River. No bridge. Just walked across it into Indiana and went back home. So that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, very dry time.
But the microbes in the water that they did drink and ingested, because they would drink anything wet, like I said, the drowned mule in the water, was not making them all sick. Oh, they're all sick and squirting diarrhea and everything else. You really want to know. On this podcast, we like to talk about diarrhea and the squirts.
It happens.
And every man was loading his pants and squirting because it was such bad. I mean, I know we think it's funny, but man, so you know what kind of shape it is. It's just like all the Confederate troops.
No wonder they're shaking when they're loading the rifles.
Really shaking like crazy. It's just like the Battle of Augusta, Kentucky. I got a shop up there, and they were all shaking and squirting too. But they had camped in a vineyard the night before, and they were hungry. They were out of food, and so they ate the green grapes. And the next day, the battle, they all had the squirts because they ate they destroyed the vineyard and the winery up there, Baker Bird's Winery. It's real famous. It's really a place where people go and head that way. But their whole winery was totally, the Confederate troops ate the green grapes. They weren't ripe and got the squirts. And like I said, Bragg was at one of those springs in the Chaplin River. But just like Bragg was an idiot, not like Buell was too, because he laid around on his cot, eating pom-poms and sugar pops and stuff. And his officers kept giving him reports. And, his failure to act in a timely manner earned him many enemies within his own army.
Yeah.
They were so angry because, they had him, 3 to 1, and surrounded.
Yeah.
And he wouldn't order the attack, So, and I was telling you what a bloody and hard fought, famous Confederate diarist, Sam Watkins, as I was saying earlier, declared Perryville the hardest fighting that he experienced in the war. And Sam Watkins was a soldier in the 1st Tennessee, and he fought in every major battle that the Confederate unit was engaged in, and that included Shiloh, Corinth, Mississippi, Stones River. That's where they had Breckinridge charge and annihilated the Orphan Brigade, Bragg, Chickamauga, Chattanooga, the Atlanta Campaign, Franklin, Nashville. In his famous memoirs published after the war, Washington said of Perryville, quote, "I was in every battle, skirmish, and march that was made by the 1st Tennessee Regiment during that war, and I do not remember of a harder contest and more evenly fought battle than that of Perryville."
Wow. Right in Kentucky.
He said he was locked. He said the 1st Tennessee was locked in hand-to-hand struggle for the Union cannons. He said, "Such obstinate fighting I never seen before or since."
So they charged the cannon?
Oh, yeah.
On foot?
Yes, with bayonets.
On foot.
And there were all kinds of Union soldiers on foot with bayonets that met them.
Oh, okay.
And it said, "The iron storm that passed through our ranks," this is from his diary, I'm looking at it now, "mangling and tearing men to pieces. At Perryville, Watkins would find that both his hat and his cartridge box had been holed by enemy fire, making him one of the lucky ones."
Yeah. Wow.
Isn't that something?
That's some bravery there.
And even Bragg said, even the coward Bragg said that for the time engaged, it was the severest and most desperately contested engagement within my knowledge, which his knowledge is questionable. And they also said there was some small Henry repeating rifles, that there was actually a general store in Louisville, and that they know that at least one and maybe 2 or 3 Union troops officers bought Henry repeating rifles, and for the first time they were used in the Western Theater at Perryville. And it's also kind of interesting to know that there were 2 officers at Perryville whose sons became famous World War II generals.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Buckner, Simon Buckner, the commander of 1/3 of the Confederate Army at Perryville. He was and then his son, Simon B. Buckner Jr., was the lieutenant general in charge of American land forces on the island of Okinawa. And he was actually killed by Japanese artillery.
Wow.
But he was a general, too. Perryville was the first battle for a young officer, Arthur MacArthur.
Arthur MacArthur?
Yes. Would earn the Medal of Honor, the Battle of Missionary Ridge, and his father, Douglas MacArthur, who would go on great fame in World War II in Korea, were the only father and son combination in American history to both have won a Medal of Honor.
Wow. Huh. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah. And then, we talk about all these statues, Mr. Cable. It's kind of interesting. I'm not sure if it's the only one, but after the Battle of Perryville, the United States government built a statue paid by the United States government honoring the Confederate dead at Perryville by the U.S. government.
Wow.
And it's still standing today. It was done in 1880. A monument was erected. It says on the monument, erected by the United States. You can go out there and read it before you tear it down.
Wow.
It's a graveyard. They put the Confederates in a mass grave, and they had slaves bury them. That's what I've heard the story was.
Wow.
And the Perryville battlefield went on for a long time. It wasn't at State Park until 1954.
Wow, really?
90 years after the battle. It was just farmland, and they've been buying up farms around there like crazy. So now it's really large. And like I said, it's a bird sanctuary.
Yeah, bald eagles. You can see bald eagles and everything out there.
See every damn thing.
Yeah.
Man, I see. Did you see what I saw? Yeah, I'm taking my grandkids out there next week. It's supposed to be 100 degrees.
Yeah.
We're going to stumble around out there and take some hot wieners, as we call them, and cook them.
Bring your sunscreen and some water. Make sure you have some water.
We're going to bring all kinds of water, and Kool-Aid, lemonade. Yeah. Largely, Perryville went largely unnoticed, and the local Lions Club down there started saying how important it was. And then as historians began to look at it again, take another look, they bought up 18 acres. Now there's probably thousands. It has nearly 1,000 acres is now the battlefield. People are contributing money to it. You can get online. It'll tell you donate now, man.
Yeah, I mean, there's a Facebook page, group.
There's a museum out there. It's a small museum. It's kind of nice. They have markers all around and hiking trails, and you can read what happened on this spot, and you just walk around. I've walked out there. I took my dogs, ran my dogs out there.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're supposed to, but there's deer and everything else out there.
Pretty nice place.
It is. I like it. And there's not well attended. There's not a lot of people out there. You can go out there and not see a person a lot of times.
Yeah.
And people have family reunions out there, used to. I don't know what they're doing now with this Corona thing.
Yeah.
But it's a pretty cool place.
Pretty cool. Big event in the Civil War out here in Kentucky, especially in our own backyard, especially if you are close to Boyle County.
Yeah. When I lived down at Perryville, we were looking for a small farm, and the Bottoms house, which is riddled with bullets and where the battle started, and it's still there. It's a log house, and there's still bullet holes in the wall and everything. And so we went out there. My wife and I and son went out there, and when he was about 5 years old, and the realtor was showing us the house, and we almost bought it.
Yeah.
We almost bought that, and I wish I had of in a lot of ways. It was right down by the Chaplain River, had a large tobacco base, and we were walking through the field, found some arrowheads, and I remember my son picked up a rock in the tobacco field.
Yeah.
And you know how kids are, he just turned and threw it?
Yeah.
And he hit the realtor right in the head with the rock, who was a friend of mine, and nearly knocked him down. And my son was only 4 or 5 years old, but you know how kids are. So I have to share that. There was another casualty on the battlefield.
Take 10,000 off the price and we'll do it again.
That's right. Later, I paid my son, popsicles, Mickey Mouse bars.
Yeah.
But I had another friend, the lawyer friend, over at Lancaster, and he told me stories. This is 40 years ago that they used to go over there, and friends of his would walk in the Chaplain River when it was low, like this time of year it gets dry. And he said you could just pick up cannonballs and broken shards of cannon in the river, bottom area, rock bottom. Yeah. He said they were all over the place. And he said friends of his just collected them and found all kinds of artillery shells. Wow. Just laying in the water, you know, just laying there in rock, just exposed where the creek was, dry creek bed. So, you know, it was just kind of local stories. And, you know, we lived in Perryville, and I'll tell you a couple of stories. We lived in Perryville. I did. And we put in a drain, like a 30-foot, maybe 40-foot pipe in our front yard in a ditch for the water to run through, and covered it over. And when we were digging the ditch out, we found a Confederate belt buckle. Yeah. That was real rare. It's worth probably $1,000. And another time, we found in the same area, we found a Spanish riel of 1790. Wow. That's where, or maybe it was 1776. It was where Harbison's Fort was. Yeah. There on the west bank of the Chaplain River, across from El Buen Inn. I also lived down the street in an old historic house. And I had a fenced-in backyard, and I had 2 basset hounds. And, you know, I taught here at Crab Orchard. And when I would go home in the evening, I'd leave my dogs in the fenced-in chain link, big, almost an acre. Yeah. And they would dig up bones and bring them to the gate every day, and they were human bones. Whoa. And I got a 5-gallon bucket and filled it with human bones where they had buried them in short graves. And right down the street, maybe 30 or 40 yards, was Dr. Polk's, P-O-L-K, was the only doctor there at the time. And they did amputations at his little office, little wooden office there. Yeah. And they had arms and legs, according to a diary, stacked up to the eaves of the house on both sides like cordwood. Wow. Wow. Oh. All the way. You can imagine that. We're talking, 14 feet high and maybe 25 feet long on both sides of the house, stacked up, legs and arms that were amputated like cordwood.
I mean, they're probably, chopping them off left and right.
Oh, You know, that's what they did.
Yeah, you got a shot in the arm, that's cut it off.
That's right. Leg, anything. Toe, whack her off. Seriously. Oh. And I lived right down the street, and maybe they were just burying parts of bodies, or maybe they were just shallow graves of people that had died. Yeah. And I lived in another house in Perryville, and on the floorboard in my bedroom was carved a cavalry horse with a crude knife into the floor. Wow. And it was there were blood stains where they had wounded laid there, and they were just carving because they were bored. Yeah. And I guess he was a cavalry, and he carved a picture of his horse. Wow. Huh. I mean, it's pretty far out stuff, pretty heavy. Yeah. People lying there dying. And then another, I tell you, I lived there, man. I was into this. Another house that I was in, I'm not going to say which one because the people don't want us, but there are actually 2 houses I know of in Perryville. That in the attic there were soldiers lined up wounded, you know, that they were caring for. And they wrote things in pencil on the ceiling, on the old mortared wall. And there were pictures and diagrams and letters to people and love messages all along the wall. Wow. Wow. Yeah. That is And someone bought that and they remodeled it, and they didn't, you know, I told them they needed to put plexiglass over it, and they just tore it out and put re-drywall it. All that historical stuff. Man. It's sad. People do that all the time.
At least take it out and give it to a museum or something.
It should have been. Yeah. Should have been carefully taken out, or it could have been just, if you just screwed in plexiglass. Yeah. I mean, that would have added the value of it, you know, the historical value. But you know how people are, man. Yeah. You know how people are. Let's bulldozer down. Yeah. So, but there's so many things have been lost in time. I guess that's one of the reasons our podcast, you know, we try to relive history and, you know, give you a feel of people with diarrhea and what it was really like, and dead mules floating, bloated mules in a pond.
It's not the first time we've talked about a dead mule in a pond.
No. That's right. That's right. Up in eastern Kentucky. That's right. Red mule. Yeah. In that book that you read. That's right. I forgot about that. Yeah. But history, man, really comes alive when you start talking like that. My son, I'll tell you another story since we're story time. And I think maybe our listeners would rather hear stories than to hear data or something. You know, there were 6,428 that faced each other off. And my son grew up in Perryville, and we loved history. And They have a huge reenactment there, and sometimes it would be the national reenactment, and the troops would come in town. We owned an antique store, and people were dressed in costume. And I mean, gosh, if you used your imagination, it was just like you were living back then.
Yeah.
And my son was like 7 or 8 or 9 years old at the time. And we would go out on the night before the reenactment battle. They always had it on Sunday afternoon, but we'd go out Saturday night about 9 o'clock, maybe 10 o'clock at night. All the public would be gone. And there would be rows of tents on the hillsides.
Yeah.
And we would walk through them, and there'd be men telling stories, dressed in uniform, with fires going where they were cooking.
Yeah.
And we would walk through it, and it was so ghostly. It was just like we were back in time.
Wow.
I mean, they were, they were strict. They had to wear the glasses and wire rim glasses, and their guns were stacked. And, the tin were rattling, and they were laying back smoking clay pipes and stuff. And it was just like, and my son, oh my gosh. He got into it.
Yeah.
It was so amazing. And now, I just want to tell you, if we roll forward, my son is a doctor of American history, PhD, and teaches history in Missouri.
Yeah, that's it.
And teaches colonial history.
Those trips through the...
And that's what we live for every year. And we would spend the evening walking up till midnight and sitting back in the grass, just the two of us, listening to the sounds and imagining that we were back in those times and kind of creeping around. It was like... so trippy.
Yeah.
I mean, I was into it.
He
was just like out of his mind. I was out of my mind. And just what a father and son thing. I mean, we just loved history, and it was real to us. I mean, we were there.
Yeah.
It was heavy, man.
Yeah. It sounds good. Sounds awesome.
Heck yeah.
Take your kids to Civil War reenactments.
Oh, yeah.
They'll become doctors.
Doctors and lawyers.
Yeah.
Yeah. When they have diarrhea, they'll be able to relate. It's not so bad, son.
Yeah.
Think about the generations that fought, and our family fought in the Civil War.
Yeah.
So many families did. Our family fought with the Army of Tennessee.
I mean,
and I'm not a traitor, so you can call me one if you want.
Well, and that's the connection, I guess, to Kentucky. I mean, Perryville was the biggest battle for sure.
Yes.
But I mean, there's more battles, and there's the people that stayed.
There's a battle here at Perryville.
The Confederate,
Battle here at Perryville.
Yeah. What?
Excuse me, Crab Orchard. I don't know where I am. I got Perryville on my mind.
Yeah.
Battle of
that's
Crab
what I'm saying. In the
Erase
Baptist church, in the Baptist church, there was the Confederate.
Well, we got a cemetery
there. There's a cemetery, right down the road.
Yeah, and it's got, you know what it's got on it? It's got a quote from Theodore that we talked about last time, O'Hara.
Oh yeah.
And the base it's got for the sleeping dead, and all. No rattling sabers anymore, and all that. They're free of that. Yeah. And it's up on top of a hill, and there's a.
It's a nice cemetery.
It's a real nice cemetery.
Yeah.
When I was younger, and some of the women teachers, we used to jog after school, and we'd jog up there at the top, and then jog back.
Yeah.
And then it was a couple of miles. It's a pretty steep hill to run, The women would run off and leave me, and I'd be overweight and panting, trying to keep up with them.
Oh,
They'd just run off and leave me.
Yeah.
Struggling on the streets of Perryville, looking
Crab
like
orchard,
a crab orchard. I don't know where I am. I'm in Perryville mode right now. Crab Orchard, thank you. Leave me on the streets of Crab Orchard, the big city.
There's
in my shorts.
There's a historical marker about the Baptist church.
Yes.
And then there's graves about the Baptist church too.
And they've been bulldozing around that, and I worry about that. That bothers me because there's a lot of markers there.
Old markers.
Civil War and before.
Yeah.
People died in the 1840s and 50s.
It's an old church.
Yeah. And then there's, people have done research on all the soldiers that were buried and where they were from. Yeah.
Yep.
One thing, talking about Crab Orchard, Crab Orchard straight now. I had a letter, and I sold it to a friend of mine. That's the trouble being an antique dealer. You need to have good things, and that you have all those things. Yeah, sell them. Some things you ought to keep, and you don't. But the letter was written by a Confederate soldier. I guess it was after the Battle of Perryville, who camped in Crab Orchard.
Yeah.
And they said that they raided a farmer's house and caught a goose, and they roasted the goose, and they said that it was the best meal that they'd had in 2 years. They roasted a goose here in Crab Orchard, and the whole letter was about the roasted goose and stealing a goose from a local farmer. So I thought that was pretty good.
A bunch of our boys died in battle, but we got us a goose today.
They got us a goose. They remember that good meal.
Yeah. Wow.
Better than hardtack and all that. But Crab Orchard was a place where John Hunt Morgan would come before the Civil War as Lexington Green, and they would run out here at the racetrack, Whitley's racetrack. We've talked about that before. And there were 2 racetracks, and the women would come out in parasols and watch all the young men, and men would be hanging with their tongues out, at the women. There were so many good-looking women down here. Still are, I guess. And, it was interesting. Those Crab Orchard girls were hot, I guess. Of course, there was a train that came in and out of here every day. Well, I'm serious. They were hot. Yeah. They were hot. I don't know if they still are or not.
That's up for debate.
It's debatable. They are. Can't slight the women. But anyway, it's true. And they come from everywhere. And it was like a dating thing back then, It was Sunday afternoon, they'd race, and then they'd have picnics with the girls, in parasols. And then, Crab Orchard had all these springs and hotels and brought in a lot of high-class people from, all over and for the spring water and dangle their little toes in the water or whatever.
Or heal their wounds.
Heal their wounds or mental wounds. Psychological neurosis,
What's that called?
That's what we need. I don't know why the school's so crazy, man. Where are the springs?
When you take what's it called? When you take a pill and it's just a sugar pill, but it makes you.
Yes.
It's not a placebo, is it?
It's a placebo.
It's a placebo.
Yeah, that's it. A placebo. Yeah. Yeah. We need something like that today for people to cool their heels. All right. I got my dog in the truck.
All right. Well, that'll wrap this one up.
It's getting hot out there.
We'll talk to you again. I guess we'll journey a little further.
Forward or back
somewhere. Yeah. We'll talk. We'll come up with something to talk about.
Sounds good. We hope you enjoyed the podcast today.
Yes. Connect to us at KY History Pod on Twitter, Facebook. Email us landbetweenthemeadows@gmail.com.
And by the way, Dolly Parton won the contest we had between that and
get it, John G. Fee.
John Fee.
We'll get us a petition going around.
I'm serious.
All right. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Bye-bye.